we're very pleased this month to have a focus on urban extension, and I'll introduce Brad here in just a few minutes and we'll get started. I do want to mention that our April 6th webinar will be focused on the Robert Wood Johnson Project, the Culture of Health Project. Michelle Rogers will lead that conversation. And then our conversation on May 4th will focus on climate change. And, again, thinking about how extension directors and administrators can make decisions or consider opportunity around a couple of really, really important topics for us. So just as important today, we have an opportunity to learn from Brad Gerlach around his experiences around urban extension and the work that Washington State University is doing specifically in the Seattle area. I think you saw Brad's introduction in the email invite, the Outlook invite, so I won't go into a lot of detail there, but I can tell you that we're excited to have Brad here as part of this conversation. As he and I chatted the other day, this evolution that Washington State University has engaged in relative to urban extension and the roles and the contributions. And to me, this really important question that I'd like us to dig in a little bit more on after Brad is done with his presentation is, how do we make a difference in an urban setting? What are the kinds of things that we can be doing? And can we think differently about that? And I think Brad's discussion with us today will really, if you're not aware of the work that Brad and his folks are doing, it does challenge us to think a little bit differently about this space. So Brad, I'm going to turn it over to you. We look forward to your comments and would ask everybody to stay muted until the end of Brad's conversation, and then we'll open it up for a great conversation. So Brad Gerlach, Brad, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, and just making sure you can hear me and see my slides.
Yes.
All right. Great. I do want to thank you for this opportunity and do greatly appreciate the interest in urban extension. And I do also want to acknowledge that the work we're doing in Washington is a result of many, many individuals who have helped develop, scope this. And so what I talk about today is really a great we, and way too many people to mention because I'd spend all our time mentioning the people who helped us get to this spot. But with that, I just want to give you a little sense of where I want to go today with the presentation, a little bit about the data and the history of what we were observing in Seattle and in King County, how we responded to that, and then sort of some of the choices that you guys may want to consider as you think about responding to urban opportunities, slide about some additional resources, but mainly have a time for discussion. So my goal here is to sort of only present for 15 to 20 minutes and then go into discussion. And so I might cover things a little bit cursory, and then we can come back and talk about those that are of interest to you on the webinar. So what were we experiencing a little bit in the Seattle and King County area? So part of this goes to the role of the county as a partner in extension. And I would say, I think it was as early as 2003 that Multnomah County in Oregon, which is where Portland is, one of the counties there, ended its relationship with OSU Extension. About that time in King County, actually a little bit earlier, King County was going through major budget cuts and was rethinking its role. And ironically, I just started my 17th year with Extension. I started in King County March 1st of 2001. And if you look at this graph on the right, the yellow bars on the bottom is King County's funding to King County Extension. And in 2000, it was about $1 million from the general fund. Starting in 2001, they had zeroed WSU out and from the general fund, and in turn provided about $600,000 of funding from the solid waste division. And for those of you not familiar with King County, that's tipping fees for the dump is what was funding King County Extension. And they were able to find a nexus between that revenue source and WSU Extension to fund ag, natural resources, and 4-H. But for the most part, that eliminated the county support for FCS programming. And what you see on this chart here is over time, the bottom, the yellow, is the King County government's direct support to extension in King County. The middle or purple bars are WSU's support to the King County Extension Office. And then the top crimson bars are sort of what the King County Extension faculty and staff were able to raise in grants and contracts. And so you can see how that ebbed and flowed over time in the early 2000s, where King County was going through significant budget cuts. The second arrow is a harbinger of another major cut coming, where in 2010, the funding was cut by 87% to WSU Extension. And a large part of that comes from this revenue issue. So the blue bars reference the left y-axis, which is the projected budget deficit in the general fund for King County. That's the most liberal spot, or where they can fund almost anything from, and these are projected deficits in millions of dollars. And then the red line represents the percent of that funding source that had to go to law, safety, and justice. And as you can see, it's approaching 80%. And so this was a structural gap where they really couldn't fund extension, and having a difficulty doing that. And that's sort of what led to a severe cut in 2010. I said an 87% in its funding. By 2011, they had zeroed extension out again. And by 2014, WSU had worked back to getting funding through a parks levy, but to the tune of $100,000. So you can see from 2000, we went from $1 million from the county to $100,000 in sort of 2014. And we talk about some of the things going on, this desire for a different program mix and a desire to tap the university research is what we were getting. Some early examples of that was the executive of King County was looking at what's the role of the county in cleaning up the Puget Sound. Our iconic orca species were starting to die from water pollution, and he wanted to know what the county could do. And so he reached out to WSU to say, how can WSU help us? Not extension, but WSU. Also, in that time when climate change was high on his list, he also brought together a whole group of universities and partners around what can the county be doing around climate change, and was actually courting Stanford University to open up a center in King County to address climate change. The other thing we were starting to see was that we often think of extension as the front door to the university. WSU has an office in Seattle, and it often was serving just as, for athletics, the president, but you were starting to see more colleges, departments putting personnel there or making sure that personnel were in Seattle to start brokering relationships in Seattle and King County to be working towards how do they work in King County and Seattle with their faculty. So the question of extension being the front door was being lost a little bit there. So how did WSU respond? It was a part of creating the Metropolitan Center separate from, in addition to, county extension. So we kind of exist as an additional layer or resource, almost like a state specialist, but we're a center that works across the state. What we do is we focus almost solely on project instead of programming. And by project, we mean a start date, an end date, a defined set of deliverables, a defined set of money for that project that is full cost recovery, including F&A, salaries, everything. And when we say projects are sort of short term, they can go from 4 months to 3 to 4 years, but we are not looking for anything that goes much longer. And I'll get into a couple of the examples we have that press that a little bit, but we found ways to get around it. We're client-centered, meaning we start with the needs of the client, develop something uniquely for them, and deliver on that. And I've worked a lot of ways of how to describe our role. Are we a broker? Are we the conduit? And I've found that it seems to work pretty well to describe the Metro Center as the general contractor for brokering the resources of the land-grant university into the city. So we find the expertise, assemble the team, manage the budgets, manage the calendar, and manage performance. Our funding, our core funding solely comes from the state, from WSU resources, and then we also derive project funding for most of our activities and to supplement salaries for our engagement on those projects. Our core funding sort of comes with dedicated money for 2 FTEs and some operating money. That operating money is shrinking. And then we have sort of transitional funding, our startup funding, for about another 1.4 FTEs that the center is expected to absorb their cost into sort of soft money funding. And we have some sort of access to hourly employees that we pay based on the hour. And one of the roles we play is also trying to add capacity to county extension offices. So where they might need some additional staffing, we bring that on. And I'll get to that in a little bit with some of the projects. But so what are some of the things we've done in our 2 years of existence? We started pretty much in 2016. One of our bigger ones to start out with is looking at helping to establish benchmarks for the restaurant industry across the state. And this really started from concerns or stuff coming about with municipal minimum wages being established in the state of Washington. The most notable was Seattle going to a $15 minimum wage. Most of the restaurant industry, individual restaurants, said there'll never be another restaurant in the city of Seattle. Everybody knew that wasn't true, but the organization, the Washington Hospitality Association, so sort of the association, came to us and said, can you help establish data benchmarks so that somebody independent can say what the score is, what are the data, and then let the associations, labor union, policymakers debate, but they just needed an independent arbiter of what the data were. That's our role. This is an example of where we stretch the idea of a project. They think we need 10 years of funding to let things stabilize and how the industry will respond. 10 years is too long for us, so we kind of set a first contract for 4 years and have a disengagement strategy, and I can talk about that if there's interest. But the point being here too is this project allowed us to engage faculty from 3 different colleges and schools. We did a very short equity study for the city of Yakima, and we actually had to reach out and find faculty from an urban serving university because we didn't have ones to turn to in our university that could meet the deliverables and timeline. We just finished up doing an age-friendly housing assessment for Seattle and King County, where we brought faculty in from 2 different colleges and campuses on WSU, plus a faculty member from Portland State University, urban serving university across the river from our Vancouver campus. While not truly a metropolitan center or a Metro Center project, the Metro Center is also host to the Western Center for Metropolitan Extension and Research, WCMER, which is 6 original land-grant universities going together. We have since added 1 new one and are expecting to add an 8th coming up in our next fiscal year. But this was a summit we put on that was really about bringing cities, their department and divisional members, research faculty and extension faculty to talk about where are there opportunities for the university to support the installation and maintenance of green infrastructure in urban areas. And we're looking like we're going to continue that work. We just finished having the summit last week and are looking at how do we continue that work. The Metropolitan Center was also helped Snohomish County Extension support 2 of its cities to compete in America's Best Communities competition, and we got them all the way to the finals and sort of built the capacity in those cities to continue doing economic development work there. And then from an internal seed grant, we started launching a Metropolitan Food Energy Water Nexus project that actually brought faculty from 6 different schools, departments, units across the university to address this Few Nexus in metropolitan areas. That helped leverage a couple of us to be invited by the University of Tennessee to join their NSF US-China Fuse project. And if all goes well, I'll be going to China at the end of this month to be working on where does metropolitan food, energy, water work on an international basis. So that's a quick overview of what we do. And I think that some of the things that I would say get into choices you may want to talk about or think about as you look at what we did or opportunities are staffing. So we rely on portfolio managers who are not subject matter experts, that they need to manage projects within a portfolio and be willing to work across the university in finding those subject matter experts, but they also have to be willing to work on projects where they aren't the expert. And understanding what project means versus doing programmatic work. And I would say I struggle with having some extension faculty understand that and be willing to say I can work on a project instead of establishing a program area. And that obviously crosses into the tenure promotion area that we're working forward on. But I'd also say funding. Like I said, we tried to retool King County Extension into this center, and it didn't work for many reasons. Actually, Colorado State University's Denver Extension has been successful somewhat in retooling an office, but for us, one of the reasons was we didn't want the partnership and the relationship with the county to drive what we did and how we did it. And so dedicating hard dollars, state dollars to at least core funding for the center was a key piece. And this sort of program project is it a both and I would say, we separated the two. So I serve across all of the state and address try to develop projects regardless of where the metropolitan area is. So we don't work solely in the Seattle area, but we still have a King County Extension office. We still have a Pierce County Extension. We still have a Snohomish County that work more in your legacy programs. They do grant projects too, but that's more of the, I would say, traditional extension. We chose to separate it. You may choose to do both in the same office. Talked a little bit about tenure and promotion, that obviously can be an impact depending on your organization of how do you handle establishing depth of work for tenure and promotion if you are project driven, which means it's people coming to us. And then I put in here counting and impact. And this is a big one for us, is that the recognizing in urban areas trying to do direct service is an area where I think it's very difficult to have impact. And sort of the story I would tell is when I was in King County Extension, we had a FNET program that, I think the faculty member had 5 to 6 FNEP educators. They manage, I can't remember, it was 20 to 30 people, or families in their portfolio. And that was our impact in King County. She attended a church that had volunteers working in nutrition education and had 150 volunteers working in the community. And so I sort of asked the question, wouldn't we be better off working with 6 churches who each had 150 volunteers and reached all of those individuals, and we just provided the education and support to those churches. They managed all the volunteers, they managed all the impact, and we just need to know, what does our county mean? To me, 100 is not 100. 100 people who impact policy is much more important to me and to the center than direct serving 100 individuals. And it's just pure numbers in the urban area. So we tend to work more on policies, number of departments and schools we touch. Those are sort of what we count. So I'll leave this up while I talk a little bit about some other things, but these are things where I could say you could go get some more information. Extension in the Urban West was sort of the founding document back in 2008 that really started launching what Western states and WIDA supporting work around urban extension. in the recent Journal of Human JHSE, I forget exactly what it's for, but their issue, just their recent issue earlier this year or early last year, was a special issue on urban extension. And in there is an article about WSU's subject matter centers. We have 3 of them, and the Metro being one of them. And then Joe put out a call for its innovation special issue, and we had 3 abstracts accepted, and I realized that I'm missing a hyphen here because there's 2 that ran together, but we have the one about the Metro Center that we have as disruptive innovation. A new regional model is about the Western Center, and then what's missing, the little bullet here, is the Hotshot Dreams team is about Colorado State and their Denver extension model. So hopefully those will be coming out to get a little bit more, and then you have the NETA meeting in Portland. But one thing I just kind of wanted, before I open up to discussion, to touch on is I listened to your discussion, I think it was the last one, about aligning with the LGU mission. And I would say that's sort of fundamentally what our Metro Center is about, is how do we deliver the land-grant university mission to urban areas where extension is seen as the real broker. And one of the things I didn't touch on directly, but you guys did, is, the opportunity for the Metro Center is to really look at how do we bring students into real world opportunities. So if we bring faculty into projects, we are hoping when and where appropriate, they can bring graduate student and undergraduate students onto these projects. We've done some involvement with students directly that sort of recruited from me being on campus here at the Everett campus. But I think all the things you talked about in terms of contribution, recognition, alignment, collaboration, those are all things we focus on and are critical to our success. And I think that might be the main things that I wanted to cover in sort of a quick overview, and then make sure we have plenty of time for discussion or questions.
Well, excellent, Brad. Thank you very much for the insight, the experiences. I do see that Mike Gaffney is on. Mike, if you would like to add any comments to what Brad has shared with us at this point, I'd invite you to do that, and then we'll throw it open for questions and conversations.
Thanks, Chuck. I appreciate that. I would just like to first offer my congratulations to Brad for making this thing work. Right, it was a long time in the formative and the discussion stage, and Brad has done a great job of moving from that to a functioning center that has demonstrable, proof of concept projects under its belt. From the extension perspective, it really is going to be serving as a model for us in the conversation about what extension looks like in the next 5 years or so. We're in the middle of a declared process to discuss that internally and externally. Just happenstance, I met yesterday with the Policy Council for our county association to share with them the news about our fairly gloomy budget posture and the fact that we weren't going to be able to fill open positions for the next couple of years, how they might help us figure out how to be an effective organization in the face of that reality. And the model that Brad is piloting with urban extension, with the Metropolitan Center, the project focus as opposed to traditional program activities, and a departure from a residential capacity in any location, but a reliance on bringing in capacity to meet articulated needs is something that we're paying really close attention to as a model that goes way beyond urban extension in terms of informing how we might do business in the future.
And I remembered one thing I wanted to say a little bit about, I think, how we are being successful and being seen, and Mike reminded me is three things have happened that I'm excited about. One, the city of Everett had an idea of a project, wanted to meet with us, and then getting into the door while we were waiting for somebody else to arrive, we identified 4 other potential projects we could work on with the city. So those are all moving forward where they're excited. The other being, I have other extension faculty who are now wanting to align with the center because they see it as an opportunity to meet their needs. And then the third being is at the Green Infrastructure Summit, I have been working with one of my food, energy, water colleagues who's an on-campus faculty member. And we were sitting there talking, and then somebody else came up from a city in Oregon, and she took over talking about the role of extension in urban areas and all the things we could be doing in this model of how it should work. And I didn't have to say a single thing, that she became the broker for it. And I'm really seeing on-campus faculty, as they learn about it, saying, this is what we're looking for, is how can they get from Pullman to work in Seattle, work on real-world projects, have that support. So I think we're getting that traction now. So I'll stop talking and
Well, thank you, Brad and Mike. So let's throw it open. Questions or comments from anyone?
Brad, this is
Go ahead.
Brad. This is Jobert Rankin in Missouri, and we've been talking about moving from direct education more into, as you called it, like the policy and the systems work. We've had really good discussions. Have you seen your faculty? In extension, we've always had a direct education model for many years. Are they embracing moving to that broader systematic work? And have you changed their performance expectations or how you measure impact?
Yeah, a couple of really good questions. One of it being is we I only have a few existing extension faculty members who came with me versus hiring and wanting to bring on what I would say, the right people onto the bus. So part of it is recruiting and understanding that this is where we work. This is the space we work in. And if you like that, join us. If you don't, that's okay. It's not for everybody. And so getting them to understand that we're going to work at the policy systems level, that's key to coming on board. And then changing expectations, yeah, it's a little bit, but we're upfront that these are the metrics. We're still kind of doing the storming and norming phase with some folks of working towards what are the metrics we measure, how are we going to measure them, and we actually were working with our evaluation specialist. It's been almost a 12-month process of like, well, what should we be measuring? And we had all of these indicators, and we actually have, I think, 50 indicators we track. Some of them are, have to track for the federal government. Some of them we have to track for WSU in reporting back to the faculty senate, who controls the center term. But we finally got to, we really are working at the policy level, and that's what we're going to start to track. And how do we measure that? And that will be our sort of our next thing of, it's easy to do the project. It will be, how do you measure 6 months, 12 months down the road, the policy impacts you've had when you may not have funding to do that anymore because you're project-based. And so we're still figuring out how do you build that model. But I would say it is really about getting people to be on the bus and making sure they understand the expectations, and it's not for everyone.
Yeah. Thank you. That's good.
Yeah.
Brad, there's a question in the chat. Have you deviated from the NIFA mission statements much in order to do urban programs?
I will let Mike answer that question because I focus on doing my work, and I will honestly admit I don't know the NIFA mission by heart. I'd have to go back and look at it, but I think of it in the we serve everybody is my approach.
I'll say candidly that there's probably been a little bit of a cheerful expansion of the unspoken component of the NIFA mission to get to where we are on this, and it actually ties back to the last question as well, right? The other half of the question that Brad answered is how do we translate value in collaborating with the urban center to make clear to faculty that there's benefit to them, and what's the incentive structure, and that's something that Brad's working on as well, right? For some faculty, it's a month of summer salary. For some faculty, it's connecting a grad student to a research project. For some faculty, it's access to data and publication, or some blend thereof. And that's the same sort of indirect approach, I think, is the way to answer the NIFA question, right? We don't directly address that with this center, but it's pretty easy to make the indirect connection to the benefit of the projects taken on by the center in meeting that overall mission.
Chuck, can you hear me? This is Vonda. I have I guess, comment or discussion or even a question. And as I was thinking, down here in the South, we have some urban areas, but we also have what we call our small cities, like Tallahassee, where they don't have the population numbers to be considered urban, true urban, but the mentality of the people and how the people and communities operate are almost city. They're very vastly different from their rural county type of small towns. Mm. And so has there been any what am I asking? Any work done, or do you see any difference between working with your larger cities using this same model or the same way of approaching communities and people that have a city mindset, regardless of the number of people who are in that live there?
Yeah, so I can speak to that a bit of what our approach has been. And we take the word metropolitan, we're intentional about metropolitan for a couple of reasons. And one of them being, it's a very fluid definition or term that we can use how we want to. So out west, the urban-rural interdependency is very important. And so we've worked with some small towns in our ABC project. One of them, Darrington, is a town. It is not a city, but they are very urban influenced, and a lot of their success is moving from being a timber town to being connected to the larger metropolitan area of Snohomish County. But the other is, and this actually feeds a little bit more into our Western Center work, is he was coming out of like Jackson Hole in Wyoming and talking about that is they have these, smaller cities, but function a lot very differently from the rest of the state. They could use some help in understanding how they're different, and also recognizing that even though it's on a small scale, because of what's going on, it functions a lot like a big city. And in this case, you have a lot of relatively wealthy individuals coming into Jackson Hole to live, work, or to live and play, and driving prices to make it very difficult to live there and work in this, or have the service industry. And so they're seeing a lot of the dichotomies of skyrocketing house prices, how do residents afford living anywhere near town, those type of things. So I think there's the opportunity to cross your eyes a little bit, look fuzzy at what urban means or metropolitan means, and how do you learn from it. And the last thing I'll say is, one of the ways we also kind of market our services is thinking about how do cities, and however you want to define that, areas of population, think about growing to the next area, and how can you help support that growth to be positive growth instead of negative growth. So, an example of a project we're starting to work on, but give you just real quickly is, Seattle has gone into this dockless bike share program that we've got lime bikes, yellow bikes, green bikes, red bikes scattered all over the place because you don't dock them like you do with some other bike share. And there's some positive, but there's a lot of people don't like it. Well, Everett is thinking about getting bike share. How do we help them benefit from what's learned in Seattle, but do it the way they want? But you can think of, how does a suburban or a suburban city grow into the next level city, taking what they'd like from, let's say, Spokane or Boise growing to Spokane. How can Boise learn what they like about Spokane, learn to grow that way, but not take what they don't like about it? So those are ways of thinking about how do you help urban areas, however you want to define that, grow to their next level. I hope that answered the question. I got a little bit off track.
Brad, there's another question in the chat. What type of multi-state project efforts do you see for the urban projects you're working on, and how can that be augmented?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think, clearly there are two ways that, we work on, and there are opportunities. And one of them I mentioned is the Western Center allows us to work and scale, but also the National Urban Extension leaders. And that through that system allows us to work and scale. And a specific example is, I mentioned the Green Infrastructure Summit. So we invited green stormwater specialists from New Jersey, from Rutgers, to come out and be our keynote speaker. Part of our planning committee, through a various odd and kind of, an odd moving relationship is actually now with Michigan State's University's Green Institute, or whatever they call that. And so we just came off that summit. We're having a post-summit talking about how we keep moving things forward and realizing there's a lot of opportunity for the entire bandwidth or connection of basic research, applied research, extension projects, extension programming around green infrastructure viewed broadly. And we now have, through very quick connections, New Jersey, we've got Michigan State, we actually found connections into North Carolina State very rapidly. So we have the 4 geographic regions represented. I think the next step for us then is we're going to go back to Newell, who has regional caucuses, and say, how do we move this forward? And then, as a really shameless plug, I see this as being a real opportunity for the National Urban Extension Conference, May 2019 in Seattle, about how do we work on innovating and collaborating within regions and multi-regional to do projects like this. And we're looking at, are there opportunities for nesting, Hatch research funds, which is what New Jersey uses a bit, and I need to learn a bit more. Can we do that from WSU? But one that we're really excited about coming out of this Green Summit is it seems ripe for going after an NSF research collaborative network that would fund establishing the coordination and then allow those regions to go forward. And I think the fact of layering through the National Urban Extension Group of how do we pull so we can get applied research all the way down through on the ground programming. That's just one example, but I think there would be many other ones. The project that just came out about holding dialogues, right? There's an entity funding holding community dialogues, and obviously, that's been an issue where Extension's been working around opioid issues, but it's also the rapid response of how do we do this. So I think the sky's the limit. I think the issue is more of how do we prioritize or be strategic about which ones we pick. And Chris, did you want to add anything with your connection to Newell? Chris has been a great supporter of urban.
Mm-hmm. He has.
No, Brad, thanks for your comments. I think you did a good plug. There's great opportunities for extension staff that are programming in urban environments to connect and network better so that there's synergism. That's what we're looking for, I think. Thanks.
Brad, you may be able to see the comment about salary commitments relative to short-term versus long-term programmatic commitments. So how do you bridge? How do you figure out the salary deal?
Well, the easy ones are those who are hard money funded. So a lot of our model is attracting university or research faculty who are, quote unquote, campus based. If they're hard money funded, we buy out their time. And then, when they're done working with us, they go back to their day job, as I would call it, whatever else they're being paid to do. If they're 9-month funded, then, as Mike alluded to, it gives us an opportunity to provide them that 1 or 2 months of summer salary, which they benefit. The soft money funded folks are the more difficult ones, and even within the center, and where we're having the conversation is, in terms of the center, we're all in. We all work for each other and we work for the center. And so where we're trying to get to is establishing that we have a center budget that has a certain amount of salary obligation, and a certain amount of that comes hard money and a certain amount of it soft money. And we all have to agree to meet that salary obligation. The benefit we have at WSU, and I don't know how it applies to other universities, is when, like, I'm hard money funded, have permanent budget line. When I'm written into a grant, my salary savings comes back to the center, and so that I can then distribute that across soft money funded folks to fill gaps in. And Mike has been gracious with helping to fill in gaps during our startup phase. Does that answer the question? Are we using federal grants? Yes, if we can get them. Clearly, NSF funding would be one of them. And I would just maybe use this as a launching off point. One of the things we really were intentional about and trying to do is, when we started the center, we intentionally stayed away from what I would call traditional extension places. And one of the probably easiest ones to get into that we stayed away from was urban food systems. Because the intent of the center is really to represent all of what a land-grant university can do and all of the issues and opportunities it could address in urban areas. And if we came out of the gate in a food space, it would put us right back into the box of, quote unquote, the agricultural college. And that's not what we're trying to be. We are really trying to be the broker to everything the university can do. So we were somewhat intentional of not taking that low-hanging fruit and trying to find things like benchmarking performance of businesses, those type of projects. So, but we sort of have 3 ways we see how projects come to us, and this is sort of as we're learning, is one, people come to us because they hear about us and we work with them on a contracting basis. The other B is sort of having an intermediary come to us, and that can be, does a county office have an opportunity, but they don't have the capacity or staffing, and they need our ability to be the general contractor. And that America's Best Communities was an example. And then the third is us cultivating space, and that can be going after RFPs and grants in areas where we want to work and we may not have the actual projects yet, and we have maybe some of that benefit right now that we're not at capacity, but we're trying to manage those. But federal grants are definitely something we would go after. And we have 2 of them we've just submitted to NSF's smart, it's connected communities, but it's smart cities funding.
So Brad, I think you've touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious about, how do you stay current with emerging issues and opportunities that, number one, you'd be interested in, number 2, Washington State has some capacity in, but number 3 are just opportunities. They're ways for your center to be involved in important conversations and important projects. So how do you stay current?
Networking. I mean, one of it is the 2 core folks, myself and my the other member of the center who's been with me since 2005 or 6 in King County, is we've been here for, 15 years? So we sort of have our networks. The other is, the folks we've added have been somewhat intentional, strategic, in that they bring different networks to us. So they work in different spaces. And then we've been intentional about trying to grow. I am, on a bunch of listservs, so a lot of stuff comes across my desk to try to see, is that an opportunity? Through the Western Center, we sort of have been developing a request for expression of interest as a way of how do we quickly go out and find expertise? Because it's impossible for me to know what WSU expertise has. Now, I've got a few critical connections I've developed over the time who are brokers into other things. So we have a Center for Environmental Research Extension and Outreach. They're the ones who was the seed funding for our food, energy, water, but I know the core faculty member there, they have, 60, 100 affiliates. I reach out to them, they go out to their network. And so it's sort of that, getting people to understand our model, and then we bring affiliates on. We have a few of them on our webpage that we sort of, our agreement with them is we go to you, you understand how we work. We go to you kind of first. Hey, is this a space where you can work? An economist. Is this something you can work on? No, but I know, in my department or in the neighboring university, I know these folks, they may be interested. So it's sort of that 1 to 2 degrees of separation, and how can we get them quickly to us?
Brad, do you see Barbara's question in the chat?
Sorry, yes, I still have a lingering cold, so I'm muting myself a fair bit and I forget to take it off. My answer is yes, it's both. That, I would say our goal would be we get to a spot where everybody's coming to us, we're seen as the person to come to. But it's not always that way. And I would say, I mentioned the thing about the bike share. That was actually, I would say a combination. City of Everett reached out to us to, through various connections to see if we could help them with analyzing a work release program and analyze that data on its effectiveness. And so we were there waiting for the person from public health to come in. I was meeting with the city manager, and we're looking out the window and talking about, well, they've got this parking structure that's like 3 blocks away from this children's museum, and nobody wants to park in the parking structure and walk to the museum, that they're having all these parking issues. And that led to the thing about a broader transportation and the first and last mile. And I'm like, oh yeah, the whole thing about bikes and the bike share. Like, oh, bike share? I'm like, yeah, well, we've been kind of thinking about this. And like, oh yeah, we've been approached by this bike share company. And so that was sort of the, we're interested in working in this bike share. We've got somebody who does big data, and that's what really excites us about the bike share. And so we're sort of to say, hey, would you be interested in this? This is something we see it could be an issue for you because, working in Seattle, I see people highly annoyed with the bike share. I see people who really love it. And it's like, hey, that could be an opportunity where we could help you learn from what went right and what went wrong, and our ability to work with the bike share program nationally and see, for us, the other one would be Spokane. Hey, what happens when it gets cold out? Through the Western Center, are we able to help somebody from Boise or Denver to go in and say, hey, bike share may be an option. Through the Western Center, we could help look at what's worked in other cities that have really cold winter climates in bike share. So I would say it's a both and. And I would say for the folks who are entering questions through the chat, if I don't answer your question, chat back in. Let's see. What do we push back from urban stakeholders? I would say we don't get pushback because there's still county extension who is filling that role responsibility, and we are, an add-on separate. So we're trying to not compete in that space, and we sort of leave it up to the county extension to manage that. We do want to get to a spot where, and what our motto is, and we don't have examples of this actually working. Well, we may in a little bit, depending on how you want to look at it, is if we work on a project and coming out of that project, there's the opportunity for long-term programming. Our desire is to first go to the county extension office to say, is this a space that you want to take up? And in an ideal world, whoever funded the project research would then fund the ongoing programmatic research. And so can we bring a program opportunity, a long-term engagement, direct education opportunity to a county office with expanding their pie of funding to deliver on that? And I say sort of the example is part of our ABC, America's Best Community work, was helping to facilitate discussion around institute, I can't remember what it's exactly called, but it's sort of an experiential learning school, out-of-school institute. And we helped establish the governing structure and infrastructure because it's a few high schools and a couple of colleges. And now the local extension offices picked that up as a way to plug in both their environmental ed, but their 4-H and environmental ed. And so that's more, I see it's more of a added value than we don't try to get into that space. We've never been into it, so we're not getting pushback.
Brad, a question that came to me, do you find yourselves having to balance delicate political or social issues when you address urban problems?
Yes, and I would have to say we haven't done a whole lot, and I guess I look forward to the opportunity of having that as more of an issue. I think at times I get on my high horse, and just maybe I'll getting there is one of the, I think we as public institutions and we should be comfortable working in that space, that we can't let ourselves get either willingly moved towards or get pushed towards the divides our country is seeing. And I think our ability to weigh into the fray should be a hallmark of what extension and what a land-grant university does. To me, that's sort of our fundamental mission. And I think one of the things that showed where there's opportunity for growth, or what I would say you could look at the other way around, is it's an indicator we're not doing that job, is there was a very contentious food labeling issue that came up out here. And both sides of the argument, I learned about this later, went to various entities in the university and asked us to stay out of it. And that seems odd to me, that it's like, I think, what we get into is, what is the value of science? What is the value of knowledge? How do we help people think critically? And if we stay out of contentious issues, then we lose that opportunity to teach that and demonstrate that. And that the important thing is I think people have talked about it, and I would say this is the real spot for us in terms of hosting wicked problem conversations, is we don't need to necessarily provide the answer, but if we provide the space for discussion, understanding the trade-offs that come with an issue, and supporting a community in deciding upon action or actions and helping them move that direction, that opens up spots for us then to also come in as identifying subject matter experts from the university to bring in to talk about that expertise, that issue. How does that help the community move forward? How do we help come in and monitor the impacts and the movement forward? This will get way off the rails, but I think a real space where I think county extension could see working in this space in a new way to work with their county partners is to think about joining your county as a backbone agency within the collective action framework, our collective impact framework, right? What is the ability of the university to do very, very well is communicate information, monitor impact, help bring people together around an issue coalitions and start aligning effort. To me, that seems like a really fruitful spot for extension to work, whether it's urban or rural. But if you look at the collective impact framework coming out of Stanford University's landmark article and what they define as a backbone agency, I think there's a real opportunity there.
So Brad, we're approaching the end of our time. I think we have time for one more question. And this one sounds interesting. If we wanted to make a big bet on this work, in other words, give you $100 million over 10 years. See, Mike's already counting here, right? How would you direct that investment? So open door opportunity right here.
First, I'm going to ask, where is Rebecca from, and does she have that $100 million? Because boy, we'll have a long conversation after this. I think the big bet would be to fund and seed thematic areas where you could really drive the value of the land-grant university. So the things I've struggled with of how we get to, but I think the opportunity, and this would be the opportunity to do it, is to say there are thematic cores we should be working on, and that as a public university, we have the right time horizon in terms of decades, centuries to be looking towards. And how do we really help drive innovation and opportunity across those areas? And so, examples would be here is looking at, resiliency in all of its phases of community resiliency, environmental resiliency, business resiliency in the face of major external changes. And the rapid change you see in urban areas can be from climate change. Out here we've got big water issues of form and timing, and how do communities be resilient? But part of it is we're a climate refugee area where it's already identified. Not only are we having huge population growth from booming economy, but we're going to be a climate refugee area. So we're going to get even more people coming in with that. So the opportunity to establish, almost like research collaborative networks with seed money to help develop long-term views and directing urban applied research in how do we work, bringing together business, community organizations, and have those long visions. I could think of, $100 million. I probably, if I had, is that $100 million over 10 years, or do I get 10 years of $100 million per year of funding? But if it's total of $100 million, you start chunking off a couple of these thematic areas, and you can burn through $100 million actually quite quickly. But I would see it as how do we start building that infrastructure to drive ongoing investment. So, Rebecca, do you have $100 million for me?
That would be fun, huh? Well, Brad, our time is up and it's gone really fast. Thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you so much for your insight. We're just really, really pleased to have you part of this conversation and challenge us to think differently about extension in a metropolitan space. So thank you for your time today, and thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.